This is the second in a series of audio essays that address common critiques of Bitcoin. This essay in particular deals with concerns regarding the energy consumption of the Bitcoin network, specifically Bitcoin mining. If you don't understand the basics of Bitcoin mining, or what Bitcoin is and why I'm talking about it, I strongly recommend you watch the video The Orange Pill on this channel. I'll link it in the description. It's just under an hour long and acts as a primer on the fundamentals of Bitcoin, including the function and process of mining, which will be important to understanding the rest of this video. I am Yevgeny Nurish, and this is Critique 2, The Cost of Energy. Among the most popular complaints levied against Bitcoin is its consumption of energy. Many organizations, government or otherwise, have been very critical of Bitcoin's use of energy, and there has been a great deal of heated debate over whether or not Bitcoin's energy use is necessary, justified, inefficient, or even harmful. Given that climate change and environmental disruption are major political issues at the moment, in addition to the ongoing European energy crisis, it's understandable that this is one of the most common talking points amongst critics or newcomers to Bitcoin today. Unfortunately, the quality of this discourse is generally quite low and is dominated by sensationalist headlines, inflated estimates presented as reliable statistics, and ignorance and misunderstandings about the reasons that Bitcoin consumes energy in the first place. This essay is meant to clarify the facts of Bitcoin's energy consumption so that you can make a determination about whether or not you believe it's worth it. While I am very obviously in the yes camp, I intend to do my best to present an unbiased picture of the very complex energy production landscape and Bitcoin's place in it, and why I believe that all things considered, Bitcoin miners are objectively one of the most benign end users of energy of any industry in the world today. My perennial disclaimer continues to be, this is short-form audio content, and it is not going to paint a complete and holistic picture of all things discussed. As always, I encourage listeners to do their own research, both to validate my statements and to develop and enhance their own understanding of everything discussed. The best place to start is a quick recap of why Bitcoin consumes energy in the first place. A foundational presupposition of Bitcoin is that the incursion of real-world cost is essential to real-world value. Reality itself is defined by the ways in which matter is constricted. All things in the universe have finite material boundaries, restrictions on what they can do and how they can behave. Whether you are a monkey or an electron, you are bounded by the laws of physics. You cannot sprout wings and fly, you can't teleport through space, and you can't spontaneously create matter from nothing. Yet, when it comes to money, humans somehow willingly submit to the delusion that these restrictions do not apply, that we can just stack various forms of debt on top of each other with no material cost to the production of that debt, and keep adding to that pile ceaselessly and without consequence. Fiat literally means money by decree, meaning that under fiat principles, those responsible for the management of the economy believe they can simply speak money into existence. I give a more detailed breakdown of how Bitcoin mining works in my essay, The Orange Pill. But the abridged version is essentially that Bitcoin is produced by solving puzzles that are extremely computationally intensive, and there are computers designed to solve these puzzles called Application-Specific Integrated Circuits, or ASICs. The practice of requiring energy to create a cryptographic proof is called proof of work, and it is what ties Bitcoin as a digital currency to the physical world. Because Bitcoin uses proof of work as its consensus mechanism, and proof of work requires the consumption of energy to produce or mine Bitcoin, it establishes a prohibitive physical cost, meaning that Bitcoin cannot be simply spoken into existence in the same manner as fiat monies. You have to work for it. This simple innovation simultaneously backs Bitcoin with the cost of wattage, and provides security for the network by making it prohibitively expensive to attack. A common talking point of critics is that there are other less energy-intensive forms of cryptographic proof, and that because Bitcoin refuses to switch over to those protocols, it is stubborn, antiquated, or actively anti-environment. While it is true that there are other consensus mechanisms that consume less energy, they have major trade-offs that Bitcoiners consider unacceptable. For instance, last year, the popular cryptocurrency and software platform called Ethereum switched their consensus mechanism from proof of work to something called proof of stake. I won't go into all the details here, as the differences merit a significantly longer discussion. But in short, while proof of stake requires much less energy than proof of work, it also concentrates decision-making power in the hands of those who control the largest stake of Ethereum's native token, Ether. Proof of stake is a consensus mechanism that necessarily results in illiquidity, centralization, censorship, and risks to the security and integrity of the Ethereum protocol. And while as a result it's more agile and flexible for software developers to build applications on top of, it invalidates Ether as a sound money, and instead turns it into something more akin to a share of stock in a technology company. Bitcoin's energy consumption is essential to and inseparable from its ethos and core value proposition, as well as its functionality. Flexibility in a protocol is not something you want when the purpose of that protocol is to act as an immutable money or store of value. When you hold an asset, you don't want the rules to suddenly change at the whims of the people who hold the most of that asset. That's just Fiat 2.0. You want certain guarantees about the integrity, security, and longevity of that asset. And by incurring physical cost to back the protocol, Bitcoin does precisely that. This is why Bitcoin consumes energy. So, now that we've established why Bitcoin consumes energy, the next question is it justifiable for Bitcoin to consume energy at all? And if so, how much? Bitcoiners would, of course, say yes. Any good having value on a free market necessarily implies economic justification, and Bitcoin is valued quite highly. But let's approach this question from zero, without any assumptions about your predisposition towards ideas about whether or not the world needs Bitcoin. First, we have to establish whether or not you believe that all economies should be subject to some kind of state-based authority, usually the incestuous union of a central bank with a federal government. If you do, and you also believe that governments can be trusted to produce a currency with a monetary policy that is consistently beneficial to holders of that currency, then no. Bitcoin is neither necessary nor worth it. If you believe that assets and commodities, like stocks and gold, are not directly subject to both market manipulation and inflationary monetary policy, and you enjoy putting your faith and your money completely in the hands of centralized organizations that you have no influence over, then no, Bitcoin is not worth it. If you believe that the holders of a currency should have to accept all of the decisions that the issuers make regarding that currency without question, such as the funding of foreign wars, censorship and surveillance of taxpayers, and policies that actively hamstring their subjects, then no, Bitcoin is not worth it. And if you believe that it's possible to produce money from thin air with no consequence, that debt is as good as money, and that issuing exponentially more debt year after year with no end in sight is a fundamentally good thing that will produce favorable outcomes for humanity, then no, Bitcoin is absolutely not worth it. However, if you believe that providing a tool for economic liberation for 8 billion people, one that enables them to store value in an immutable protocol designed to last forever, is a worthwhile endeavor, then yes, Bitcoin is worth it. If you believe that there is value in a truly scarce asset that has no issuer and is therefore not subject to decisions of people you didn't agree to give power over you, who have the arrogance to presume to speak for your interests and the interests of your family and community, then yes, Bitcoin is worth it. If you believe that a technology that gives people the choice to opt out of inflation and an alternative to assets and currencies that are subject to brazen manipulation by a fundamentally corrupt system is a technology worth devoting resources to, then yes, Bitcoin is very much worth it. I believe that true global economic freedom and the potential human flourishing that a frictionless, trustless, universally desirable money will help bring about is worth many more times the energy that the Bitcoin network consumes today, or ever will consume. But I understand that not everyone will agree with that position. So the next question is, how much energy does Bitcoin actually consume? And just as importantly, what types of energy? Before we discuss how much energy Bitcoin uses, it's important that we're all on the same page about how energy consumption is measured. A watt is the basic unit of electrical energy output or consumption, and is equivalent to 1 joule per second. A watt-hour is a unit of energy equal to 1 watt of power applied for 1 hour. If an appliance with a power rating of 100 watts is used for 1 hour, it will have consumed 100 watt-hours of energy. If the appliance is used for 2 hours, it will have consumed 200 watt-hours of energy, and so on. Almost all industrial energy consumption is measured in terawatt-hours, one of which is equal to 1 trillion watts per hour. It's difficult to precisely measure the energy consumption of any given thing, especially one with global distribution. Most estimates put Bitcoin's global energy consumption today in a range between 90 and 130 terawatt-hours per year. For the purpose of consistency, even though it's more likely that Bitcoin operates on the lower end of that range, Let's use the largest estimate of 130 terawatt hours as the basis of our operating assumptions. Without a frame of reference, 130 trillion watt hours sounds like a lot of energy. If every human being on Earth tried their absolute hardest to generate electricity with a hand crank at the same time, we would not even be able to produce 1 terawatt hour. However, global energy consumption is about 25,000 terawatt hours, meaning that even at the highest range of estimates, Bitcoin accounts for roughly 0.5% of the world's energy consumption. Keeping in mind that Bitcoin is a globally utilized monetary network with over 100 million users, let's look at the consumption of some other entities. All of the world's data centers, the places that house the world's commercial servers, applications, data, etc., consume about 186 terawatt hours per year. The production and transportation of gold, as well as the gold market, consumes about 230 terawatt hours per year. Many critics and skeptics of Bitcoin will recite cliches like, Bitcoin consumes more energy than some countries, and then name impoverished countries with very low net energy consumption. Ironically, many of whom are actually adopting and benefiting from Bitcoin. As of 2019, the United States consumes just under 4,000 terawatt hours per year, and China over double that. And those figures have likely increased significantly since then. So, Bitcoin compares quite favorably both to comparable technologies and assets, and, despite the sensational headlines, consumes between 10 and 80 times less energy than most developed nations. So we know roughly how much energy Bitcoin consumes relative to other industries, but that doesn't paint a clear picture of the sources of energy, which is how we determine how environmentally impactful or green a given industry is. Before we do, we should have a quick aside about how energy grids work and what they are currently good and bad at. Again, this is a very incomplete picture. The goal here is accessibility and accuracy, not microscopic detail. According to the International Energy Agency, the global energy system loses about 60% of the primary energy it generates through conversion and transmission. This means that about 60% of the energy that is produced from fossil fuels, nuclear, and renewable sources is lost before it is used. Meaning that while we consume about 25,000 terawatt hours of energy globally each year, almost 50,000 terawatt hours of unused excess waste energy is produced. A huge part of the waste energy equation is loss of energy from two sources, electrical transfer and heat loss. To oversimplify, the farther the end user of an electrical energy is from its source, the more of that electrical energy is lost before it reaches them. The best end user of surplus energy is one that is situated on or very nearby the power plant. However, for many reasons, it's not always viable to build a power plant directly inside of a populated area where energy is needed most. Nuclear, while it is an excellent source of energy, is not something people want in their backyard, given the very marginal but very real risk of meltdown. Coal plants produce lots of unpleasant smoke that you wouldn't want to inhale all day. Hydroelectric and geothermal power are great, but they can only exist where very specific conditions are met. And renewables like solar and wind require lots of open, unoccupied land with lots of sun and wind, respectively. In other words, not in the middle of metropolitan areas. Again, where power is needed most. Heat loss is even simpler to explain. When you burn things, most of the energy you produce is just converted to hot air. If you can't capture the heat energy as you burn it, it just gets dispersed, and there's no way to recapture it. The inverse of the waste or surplus energy problem is the negative energy problem introduced by renewables. We can't control the weather, so while energy sources like solar and wind are serviceable when conditions are optimal for them, they can't support a grid that is experiencing inclement weather, which is, of course, when energy is most important. A prime example of this is the last few winters Texas has experienced. When Texans needed to heat their homes most, the energy mix for their grid was about 1% wind, 0% solar, and the remainder supplied by natural gas, nuclear, and coal. However, there is no doubt that renewables have a place in the system. There just isn't much incentive to build them, since they produce less energy and are more unreliable relative to other sources, even under the best-case scenarios. So what does all this have to do with Bitcoin? Bitcoin mining is an incredibly competitive industry. Independent miners and mining companies have one cost that reigns supreme: the cost of electricity. The only way to remain profitable is to find the cheapest sources of electricity with which to operate their ASICs. So, what is the cheapest energy? The obvious answer is waste energy. Energy that would otherwise have no consumers or users is by far the cheapest energy there is, since the marginal cost approaches zero. Because Bitcoin mining is so mobile, requiring only the building of warehouse space, cooling, and storage for the ASICs, miners can chase the cheapest power at any given place in the world, becoming the number one consumer of energy that would otherwise not be used at all. The second cheapest source of energy behind waste is renewables, meaning that not only do Bitcoin miners heavily favor clean, renewable, sustainable sources of energy, they also incentivize the construction of new renewables where there would otherwise be none. Generally, unless there is demand for energy of a specific type in a given region, that type of energy production won't occur. Bitcoin becomes what is called a buyer of first resort for this energy. In other words, anywhere renewables are being considered, Bitcoin miners are a natural first buyer of that energy, giving renewables producers an economic incentive to build. For instance, there are many small townships in rural Africa which have powerful rivers, but there is no financial incentive for hydroelectric companies to service those areas, since there is insufficient demand to justify the capital expenditure to build the required dams and turbines. However, just last year, Bitcoin miners spent millions funding the building of such dams in exchange for utilizing that energy for mining, providing reliable, clean electricity, not just for themselves, but for the residents of the villages and towns that have never had it before. Additionally, because of the mobility of miners, they can set up shop right next to virtually any power plant, meaning that they reduce the net loss of energy through electric transfer. Major power producers, such as TEPCO, the largest electric provider in Japan, have already begun to build mining facilities on site that utilize otherwise completely unusable energy from heat loss, something that has simply never had a viable use before. Bitcoin miners have another unique quality that supports energy grids: the ability to turn off. An overwhelming majority of electrical consumers are unable to shut off during periods of extreme stress on electrical grids. For example, data centers can't stop running, or all the services and information contained on them will be unavailable to their customers, which range from conventional businesses to emergency services. However, Bitcoin miners can simply shut off and turn on at will, making them one of, if not the single, most benign buyer of electrical energy. This was demonstrated during the Arctic blast that swept the US in 2022, when Bitcoin miners in Texas voluntarily shut off their units en masse during the snowstorms to support residential consumption, enabling tens of thousands of homes to keep the heat on and stay safe. As a less important but still noteworthy aside, ASICs also produce a nominal amount of heat naturally from running, like all computers, and there are several companies that have released products that heat homes while mining, potentially making the homeowner money while serving a vital heating function. All signs indicate that we will see many more creative uses of Bitcoin mining that demonstrate its robustness. Bitcoin promotes renewables, strengthens grids, and provides value to businesses and homeowners beyond the already powerful core monetary function of Bitcoin, and it will only continue to do so in the years to come. Considering that this is an essay about critiques of Bitcoin, we would be remiss to leave out one of the most important elements of any criticism: its source, and the incentives of that source. The most common place I hear the energy critique is from well-meaning but misinformed people who are simply concerned about the environment and have read or heard somewhere that Bitcoin's energy consumption is something that they should be alarmed about. It's very rare that these people are able to produce any facts or figures about Bitcoin's energy consumption in absolute terms, let alone relative to other consumers of energy. While I'm happy for the opportunity to educate, it begs the question of, where did they get the idea Bitcoin's energy consumption was bad in the first place? Some of the loudest and most public detractors of Bitcoin's energy use up until now have been entities like the World Economic Forum or the International Monetary Fund. These also happen to serve as strong examples of entities whose motives are perfectly aligned against Bitcoin. This is not to say that bias against something inherently invalidates facts about that thing, just that an argument from a source that has something to gain by promoting negative narratives about Bitcoin should be considered cautiously, and the veracity of their statements should be investigated thoroughly. In fact, as a Bitcoiner, I have an incentive to attack anti-Bitcoin organizations and narratives, so the same applies to me. Just because everything I'm about to say is true doesn't mean you should accept that without confirming it for yourself. The World Economic Forum, for instance, has famously and quite sincerely used the phrase, "You will own nothing and be happy," when describing its hopes for the future of humanity. This is an organization that is antagonistic to the idea of property ownership as a concept, and Bitcoin is the most pure and unassailable form of private property that has ever existed. It stands to reason that they would want to create uncertainty about it. The International Monetary Fund, or IMF, has an incredibly strong incentive to promote negative narratives against Bitcoin adoption, especially in the developing world. The IMF is the organization with the most to lose in a world where Bitcoin gains momentum, as their existence is predicated on the equivalent of economic enslavement. I won't go into great detail here, but the IMF has an outstanding track record of obliterating foreign economies by going into impoverished but agriculturally abundant countries under the auspices of humanitarian aid. Often, these countries could easily produce a variety of crops and become economically independent with very little capital. Instead of empowering them to do so, the IMF issues predatory loans to the corrupt governments of those countries in exchange for their conversion into single export economies that cheapen the cost of specific goods for developed countries. While the IMF decries Bitcoin's supposed environmental impact, they are simultaneously and directly responsible for the destruction of nearly 50% of Bangladesh's mangrove forests, forests which are not only essential to Bangladeshi wildlife, but also protect their coastline from the destructive tropical cyclones they are besieged with each year. They destroyed these forests to install shrimp farms, which is great news if you are a U.S. consumer of shrimp, and not so great news if you are Bangladeshi and enjoy being alive. However, lately, even the loudest of those who stand in opposition to Bitcoin are beginning to change their tune. While the leadership of the World Economic Forum, notably Klaus Schwab, have continuously called for changes to Bitcoin's proof of work, others in the organization feel differently. While the leadership of the WEF, notably Klaus Schwab, have continuously called for changes to Bitcoin's proof of work, others in the organization feel differently. Contributors to the WEF, such as Evan Tchaikovsky, have changed their tune in recent years and are beginning to publish much more favorable articles and essays on how Bitcoin is not only sustainable, but an enormous net positive for economic freedom and energy grid support. I'll link one such article in the description that conveniently provides a little additional color on how Bitcoin's energy use compares to other industries, although the data is a bit dated. I suspect there is much more tune changing to come. The more people who approach Bitcoin in good faith and learn about it, the harder it is to be opposed to it. Bitcoin continues to demonstrate its potential to not only provide economic freedom for humans, but to be one of the most actively beneficial consumers of energy for the environment, a feat very few technologies can claim. Though there is certainly much more to learn, I hope this has provided a foundational understanding of Bitcoin's energy consumption, why it consumes energy, how much energy it consumes, what types of energy it consumes, and why certain individuals and groups may promote narratives that inflate, if not outright falsify, the magnitude of Bitcoin's energy consumption and environmental impact. Whether or not Bitcoin's use of energy is justified remains, as always, up to you, the individual. If you are still in the against camp, I would love to hear from you. Feel free to drop a comment below, and I'll respond as I'm able. As always, thanks for listening.
You're scared of a world where you're needed, so you never made nice with the locals, but you tied me up slow with your vine.